Welcome to Story Planet. Take a breath, let the world slow down. Here stories unfold like the turning of a page. Soft, steady, full of wonder. Step into Sweetwater Creek where secrets are tucked into old ledgers, where lanterns glow warmly against wooden shelves, where a store is more than a store, it's a keeper of stories. Tonight, the past is ready to be shared. Settle in, the journey begins now. 1875, Sweetwater Creek, Georgia. The autumn wind whispered through the golden leaves, swirling them around Clara Whitmore's boots as she stood before the wooden door of Whitmore's general store. The familiar brass key rested cool in her palm, a weight both literal and figurative. Morning sunlight dappled through the maple trees lining the quiet street, casting flickering shadows upon the store's time-worn sign. The letters, carved by her father's steady hand decades ago, remained proud despite the years of wear. The scent of Sweetwater Creek in autumn was unchanged. Freshly baked bread drifting from the bakery, the crisp spice of drying leaves, and the damp earth after an early morning rain. It was a scent Clara had known since childhood, a scent that carried with it 1,000 memories of warm afternoons spent in the store, her father's laughter echoing between the shelves. She exhaled softly, steadying herself before pushing the key into the lock. It resisted for a moment, much like her own heart, but then gave way with a quiet click. The door creaked open, revealing the store bathed in soft, golden light, its interior wrapped in the hush of early morning. Dust motes swirled in the air, catching the sunlight like tiny stars. The wooden floor, polished smooth by years of footfalls, let out a soft groan beneath her boots. The scent of aged oak, dried lavender, and something faintly sweet, perhaps the memory of pipe smoke, still clung to the air. Clara stepped inside, her fingers grazing the shelves as she passed. Rows of tin coffee canisters, sacks of flour, bolts of colorful calico fabric, all standing as they had for years, untouched but waiting. Jars of penny candies sat on the counter, their contents bright and tempting, as if still hoping for eager hands to reach for them. But the store, once alive with voices, now felt different. Quieter. Waiting. She let out a slow breath, pressing a palm against the counter. This had been her father's domain, a place where he had greeted every customer with a warm smile and an easy tale. To him, the store had never been just about goods. It had been about the people, the stories they brought with them, the way they lingered in the walls long after they had left. And yet, standing here now, she could feel the absence of him, like a hollow ache in her chest. The place that had once been so full of life, warmth, and laughter now held only silence. A silence that longed to be filled again. A sudden rustling broke the quiet. Clara turned sharply, heart hammering. The curtains near the window swayed slightly, but the morning breeze had been still just moments ago. She exhaled, shaking her head. Just the wind. She stepped behind the counter, where stacks of yellowed ledgers still sat in neat piles. The ink from her father's careful records faded but precise. She traced the edge of one book absent-mindedly, letting memories drift over her like a warm tide. And then her boot caught on something. A small resistance beneath the worn floorboards. Frowning, she knelt, pressing her fingertips between the cracks. Something was there. Something hidden. With careful fingers, she pried it loose and held it up. A letter. The paper was old, the edges curled slightly, the ink faded yet still legible. A wax seal had once held it closed, but time had crumbled it away. Her breath caught as she turned it over. The letter was addressed to her father. A date, August 3rd, 1868, was scrawled at the top in careful handwriting. A slow, uneasy realization settled in her chest. Her father had never mentioned this letter, never spoken of it, never answered it. And yet, here it was, tucked away beneath the floorboards, waiting to be found. Why had he hidden it? Who had written it? And why had it remained unread for so long? Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper, scanning the words, heart pounding. But before she could read further, chime! The soft, familiar sound of the store's doorbell rang through the stillness. Clara's head snapped up. The store had been empty just moments ago, and yet now the bell above the door swayed gently, announcing a visitor. She looked toward the entrance, where golden light spilled into the store, and saw the outline of the first customer of the day. And just like that, the first story of Sweetwater Creek had arrived. The golden morning light streamed through the store's front windows, casting soft shadows along the wooden shelves as Clara Whitmore turned toward the door. The bell above it had just chimed, the sound still ringing in the stillness of the store. She inhaled sharply, the letter still clutched in her hand, its edges curling slightly beneath her fingers. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun. His frame was lean but sturdy, his worn coat and dust-covered boots, telling of long travels. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, revealing a face lined with years spent on the road, yet his eyes held a warmth that softened his features. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice carrying a gentle southern drawl. "I hope I'm not intruding." Clara straightened her posture and tucked the letter into the pocket of her apron. "Not at all," she said, smoothing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Welcome to Whitmore's General Store. What can I do for you?" The man's gaze wandered the shop, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Been a long time since I stepped foot in a place like this. Reminds me of home." He moved toward the counter, his fingers grazing over a tin of coffee beans. "Name's Silas Finch. I'm just passing through." Clara nodded politely. "Where are you headed?" Silas chuckled, setting down the tin. "Wherever the road takes me, I suppose." He looked at her then, studying her face. "But I do have a habit of stopping at general stores like these. Places like this, they hold stories." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Stories?" Silas leaned on the counter, his expression thoughtful. "Every store has a tale, Miss Whitmore, and if you listen close enough, you'll hear 'em. Sometimes in the way the floor creaks underfoot, sometimes in the handwriting of an old ledger, but mostly in the people who pass through." Clara found herself intrigued. "And do you collect these stories, Mr. Finch?" His lips quirked. "You could say that. Some collect gold, others collect debts. Me? I collect forgotten things." Her fingers brushed over the pocket where the hidden letter rested. The weight of it seemed heavier now, more significant. Perhaps it too was a forgotten thing, waiting to be remembered. Silas noticed her glance and tapped a finger lightly on the counter. "Speaking of forgotten things, I once heard about a letter lost in time, one that never reached its intended hands." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "It's funny how things have a way of resurfacing." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Could he know? Was this some coincidence, or had he come for something more than just idle conversation? Clearing her throat, she turned toward the shelf behind her and pulled down a jar of rock candy. "Would you like something sweet for the road?" she asked, trying to shift the subject. Silas smiled, sensing her hesitation. "That depends. Do you take stories as payment?" Clara huffed a soft laugh. "I suppose that depends on the story." Silas chuckled. "Fair enough. How about this? There's a tale about a man who made a promise long ago, right here in Sweetwater Creek. He left behind something valuable, entrusted to the safest hands he could think of. But time has a way of burying things, doesn't it?" Clara felt the letter burn against her palm. This was no coincidence. She met Silas's gaze, her pulse quickening. And what happened to this promise? Silas exhaled slowly, his expression growing solemn. "That, Miss Whitmore, is a tale waiting to be finished." A hush fell between them, the only sound the faint ticking of the store's old clock. The air had changed, charged with the weight of something unseen, something waiting to be uncovered. Clara knew then that her father's store was not just a place of business. It was a keeper of stories, of histories left untold, of secrets waiting for the right moment to be heard. and she had just stepped into one of them. She shifted behind the counter, pulling a ledger from beneath the glass display. The pages were filled with her father's careful handwriting, each transaction recorded with precision. But her eyes weren't searching for figures and names. She was looking for something else. A clue. A trace of the past that might reveal why this letter had been hidden for so long. Silas watched her with quiet interest. "What are you looking for?" She didn't answer at first, her fingers skimming the pages. The ink had faded in some places, but her father's meticulous records remained legible. Then, finally, her eyes landed on an entry that sent a chill down her spine. August 4th, 1868. One sealed letter, marked for safekeeping. Her breath caught. She looked up at Silas, her mind spinning. I think my father knew about the letter." Silas's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, as if he had been expecting her to say just that. "Then I reckon you've got yourself a story to uncover." Clara swallowed. The weight of history pressed down on her, and she knew this was only the beginning. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Whitmore's general store, casting long, golden streaks across the wooden floors. Outside, the slow, steady hum of town life carried on. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the occasional clip-clop of horse hooves against packed dirt, the quiet murmur of folks exchanging greetings as they passed one another on Main Street. But inside the store, the world had narrowed to the pages of a ledger resting beneath Clara Whitmore's hands. She turned each page carefully, scanning the faded ink, searching for something, anything, that might explain the letter she had found hidden beneath the floorboards. The careful penmanship of her father, George Whitmore, recorded every sale, every trade, every transaction that had passed through the store over the years. But this was not just a book of numbers. It was a chronicle of the town itself, a record of the people who had come and gone, the lives that had intersected in this very shop. Silas Finch stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching her with the patience of a man used to waiting. He had said little after their conversation about the letter, but Clara could feel his presence, steady and unwavering, like an anchor keeping her from drifting too far into the unknown. "What exactly are we hoping to find in there?" he finally asked, his voice gentle but curious. Clara didn't look up. "I'm not sure yet." She paused, fingers brushing over an entry marked August 4th, 1868, the same date as the letter. Her pulse quickened. The notation was simple: one sealed letter, marked for safekeeping. Safekeeping. The word settled in her chest like a stone. Her father had been meticulous, honest, a man who valued trust above all else. If he had kept something hidden, it was for a reason. But why? And for whom? She turned another page, then another, scanning the ink-stained lines for any clue, any name that might connect to the letter's origin. And then she saw it. Elias Hargrove, paid in full. The name sent a chill through her. She had heard it before, though not recently. Elias Hargrove had once been a prominent name in Sweetwater Creek, but he had disappeared nearly 7 years ago, leaving behind whispers of misfortune and unfinished business. Some said he had gone west in search of gold. Others believed he had been driven out by debts. "Elias Hargrove," Clara murmured, tapping the entry with her finger. "I remember hearing about him when I was a girl. He vanished years ago." Silas leaned in, studying the ledger over her shoulder. "And yet, here he is, plain as day." His voice was thoughtful, measured. "Seems to me if your father held something for safekeeping, he might have been waiting for someone to come back and claim it." Clara swallowed, the weight of the thought pressing against her ribs. Had her father expected Elias to return? Had he kept this letter hidden, hoping one day to deliver it? If so, why had he never spoken of it? The creak of the front door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway, dust from the road clinging to the edges of his coat. The late sunlight framed his face in gold. But even in the dim store, Clara recognized the sharp lines of his jaw, the worn but well-kept clothing, the way he carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who had seen too much of the world. For a moment, the store was silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Then the man stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice roughened by travel but unmistakably familiar. "I believe we have unfinished business." Clara's fingers tightened around the edges of the ledger. Elias Hargrove had returned. Silas shifted slightly, exchanging a glance with Clara. There was an unspoken weight in the air, as if the past had suddenly settled itself into the room, pressing against them both. Clara inhaled slowly, steeling herself. Elias took another step forward, his gaze scanning the store, lingering on the counter where the ledger lay open. "I see the store hasn't changed much," he mused, voice low. "It's been a long time." Clara measured her words carefully. 7 years, to be exact. A wry smile touched Elias's lips. 7 years is a long time to leave something unfinished. Silas exhaled, his posture still relaxed but watchful. "Well now, if you've come back after all these years, I reckon there's a reason." Elias's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "There is." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. The edges were worn as though it had been carried for far too long. "I believe this belongs here." Clara hesitated, then slowly took the paper from his outstretched hand. As her fingers brushed against it, a familiar sense of recognition stirred inside her. She unfolded the paper carefully, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The writing was her father's. Her breath hitched as she read the first line. "Elias, if you find this, you'll know what to do. Trust the ledger. It holds what you seek." The store seemed to grow smaller around her. The words on the page blurred slightly as the implications of her father's message settled in. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable. "I never meant to leave for so long," he admitted. "But I had no choice. Your father, he was the only one who knew." Clara swallowed hard, closing her fingers around the letter. "Knew what?" Silas's gaze darkened slightly, as if he too understood that whatever had been buried in the past was finally surfacing. Elias exhaled, glancing at the ledger still open on the counter. "That my name was never supposed to be on that list." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And Clara knew. This was only the beginning. The lanterns flickered gently, casting warm light over the wooden shelves of Whitmore's general store. The evening had settled over Sweetwater Creek, its golden hues fading into the deep blue of twilight. Outside, the streets had quieted, save for the occasional sound of wagon wheels creaking along the road. The town had begun to close its eyes, but inside the store, a story was just beginning to unfold. Clara Whitmore stood behind the counter, her fingers still curled around the note Elias Hargrove had handed her. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, steady, deliberate, every word placed with purpose. She read the line again, willing it to make sense. "Elias, if you find this, you'll know what to do. Trust the ledger. It holds what you seek." She looked up at Elias. His expression was unreadable, the years having sharpened his once youthful features. The last time she had seen him, she had been barely more than a girl, watching from the steps of this very store as he disappeared down the road, leaving whispers and questions in his wake. "You're saying my father left this for you?" Clara asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Elias nodded, his gaze steady. "He was the only one who knew the truth. I never expected to find this letter still here after all these years." Silas Finch, who had remained silent up until now, shifted his weight and crossed his arms. "That's a mighty interesting coincidence, don't you think? You show up after 7 years, and suddenly a long-lost letter just happens to turn up?" Elias turned his gaze toward Silas, offering a faint smirk. "I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Finch." Clara frowned, glancing down at the ledger that lay open on the counter. Her father's entries had been precise, each sale and trade accounted for, but the note implied there was more hidden within its pages than numbers and names. She traced her fingers along the inked lines, searching for something, some pattern or clue that she had missed before. She hesitated, then looked up. "What exactly were you looking for when you left, Elias?" For a moment he didn't answer. The silence stretched between them like an invisible thread, taut with unspoken words. Then finally he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "A debt," he admitted. "One I didn't know I owed until it was too late." Clara felt a chill run through her. "A debt?" Elias nodded. "Not money, something more valuable." Silas's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what would that be?" Elias hesitated before speaking. "My family name." Clara's fingers tightened around the edges of the ledger. The name, Elias Hargrove, paid in full. Her father had written those words 7 years ago. But if Elias was telling the truth, then he had never been meant to be on that list at all. "What happened?" Clara asked softly. Elias leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. "My father was a gambler, lost more than he ever won. When his debts caught up to him, he struck a deal with a man who had no intention of letting him walk away. By the time I understood what had happened, it was already done. The debt wasn't just his anymore, it had passed to me." Clara swallowed. "Who was the man?" Elias exhaled. "Jonathan Calloway." The name sent a ripple of unease through the room. Even Silas, who had been mostly skeptical up until now, let out a low whistle. "Calloway?" he repeated. "That man's got hands in more pockets than a card dealer at a crooked table." Clara had heard the name before. Calloway had a reputation for making debts disappear, but never for free. His favors always came at a cost. "So what happened?" she pressed. Elias straightened, his jaw tightening. "I ran." Silas let out a dry chuckle. "And now you're back." Elias didn't smile. "Because I finally figured out what I left behind." He gestured toward the ledger. "I think your father hid something in there. Something that could clear my name." Clara glanced down at the old book once more. The pages had always been her father's domain, his carefully kept records, his meticulous accounts. But now she wondered if there had been something more beneath the ink and numbers. Something meant to stay hidden until the right hands found it. She turned the page, scanning the familiar handwriting, searching for an answer. And then she found it. A notation, different from the rest. The ink slightly darker, as if it had been added later. "See the hidden drawer. Trust only those who listen." Clara's breath hitched. She looked up at Elias, then at Silas. Without a word, she reached beneath the counter, running her fingers along the wood until she found it. A small indentation, almost imperceptible. She pressed it, and with a soft click, a panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small folded document, its paper aged and delicate. Clara carefully lifted it out, her heart pounding. She unfolded it and scanned the words, her breath catching as she understood what she was holding. A deed. A legal transfer of ownership, signed in her father's handwriting. And the name on the document wasn't her father's. It was Elias Hargrove's. Silas let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Elias stared at the paper, his expression unreadable. He kept it all these years. Clara's mind raced. Her father had never spoken of this, never hinted at it, and yet he had safeguarded it as if he had always known Elias would return one day. She looked up at Elias. "It seems my father believed you deserved a second chance." Elias exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Then I suppose I better make sure I've earned it." The room felt different now, the weight of the past shifting, giving way to something new. The hidden drawer had revealed its secret, but Clara had the feeling that the story was far from over, and she intended to see it through. The morning sun poured golden light through the windows of Whitmore's general store, warming the wooden floors and casting long, soft shadows. Clara Whitmore stood behind the counter, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the newly discovered deed. It felt heavier than it should have, not in weight but in meaning. Her father had hidden this document, safeguarded it for Elias Hargrove, waiting for the right time, or the right hands to reveal it. But why? Elias leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on the paper in Clara's hands. The usual sharpness in his gaze was softened by something else. Uncertainty. The past had caught up to him, not with the force of a storm, but with the quiet persistence of a river shaping the land over time. Silas Finch, who had taken to perching himself in the nearest chair, exhaled through his nose. "Well, Miss Whitmore, looks like your father left you more than just a store. He left you the end of a story." Clara sighed, "Or the beginning of another one." She folded the deed carefully and set it aside, her mind spinning with questions. If her father had gone to such lengths to protect Elias's claim, then surely he must have known the weight of what he was doing. But why not tell anyone? Why let it remain hidden in a ledger's secret compartment? Before she could ask, the store bell chimed, and the quiet hush of the morning was replaced with the sound of approaching footsteps. Clara turned to see Mrs. Abernathy, the town's oldest resident, making her way through the doorway. She was a small woman, but carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had watched generations pass through Sweetwater Creek. Her hands, worn from time and toil, rested lightly on the counter as she peered at the three of them with an amused smile. "Well now," she mused, her voice smooth like honey over warm bread. "I didn't expect to see the three of you looking so serious this early in the morning." Silas chuckled, tipping his hat. "Just a bit of history come knocking, that's all." Mrs. Abernathy's sharp gaze flipped to Clara. "Your father was always one for keeping stories tucked away, and it seems he left you one last tale to uncover." Clara studied the older woman carefully. There was something knowing in her eyes, something that made her wonder if Mrs. Abernathy already knew about the deed. "Did you ever hear my father mention Elias's land?" she asked carefully. Mrs. Abernathy hummed thoughtfully, taking a slow breath. "Not in words, no, but I knew George Whitmore better than most. He believed in second chances, and he believed in seeing things through." Elias straightened at that. "Then why hide it? Why not come find me?" The older woman gave him a look that made it clear she had no patience for foolishness. "Boy, you were gone. You disappeared like dust on a summer wind, and no one knew if you were ever coming back." She sighed. "But your father knew you would. That's why he kept it safe." Clara felt something warm settle in her chest. She had spent the past week reopening her father's store, dusting off shelves and stocking goods, but she was beginning to realize something. This store was more than a place of business. It was a place of memory, of promises kept, and stories waiting to be finished. Elias glanced at Clara, something unreadable in his expression. "And what now?" Silas smirked, leaning back in his chair. "That's up to you, isn't it?" For a long moment, Elias said nothing. Then he took a deep breath, nodding. "Then I guess it's time to finish what was started." Clara didn't know exactly what that meant, but she had a feeling she was about to find out. As the morning carried on, customers filtered in, each bringing warmth and familiarity to the store. Clara watched as they exchanged stories over sacks of flour and tins of coffee, the space filling with the quiet hum of a town woven together by history and community. She had spent so long thinking she had inherited only a store, but now she understood. She had inherited a legacy, a place where stories, even the unfinished ones, always found their way home. And this was just the beginning. The lanterns cast a golden glow inside Whitmore's general store, their soft, flickering shadows stretching across the shelves as the night deepened. The store had long since closed, but Clara Whitmore remained behind, the quiet hum of the town's evening settling around her like a warm embrace. Outside, the distant croak of frogs and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds punctuating the stillness of the night. Inside, however, her mind raced with unanswered questions. Elias Hargrove had left earlier in the evening, but not before telling Clara he intended to stay in town for a while. She hadn't asked him where. Sweetwater Creek was small enough that word would reach her soon enough. Silas, ever the wanderer, had tipped his hat and ambled off toward the inn, though not without a parting remark. "Some stories don't like being dug up, Miss Whitmore. Just be sure you're ready for whatever's left to find." Clara had nodded at the time, but now, alone in the store, those words echoed in her mind. She traced her fingers over the edges of the deed once more, then over the rough surface of the ledger that had hidden it for so many years. There had to be more. Her father had always been deliberate. If he had kept the deed a secret, what else had he left behind? The thought sent a shiver through her. She stood from behind the counter and made her way toward the back room. The old wooden floor creaking softly beneath her boots. This was where her father had spent his late hours, sorting through records, counting inventory, occasionally humming an old tune when he thought no one was listening. She ran her fingers along the shelves, the scent of aged parchment and cedar lingering in the air. She opened a drawer, then another, searching for something, anything, that might provide more clarity. But the ledgers and loose papers she found contained only the usual details: lists of goods, receipts, a few letters from suppliers. And then, as she pushed back a stack of old invoices, she found something unusual. A small wooden box, its edges smooth from years of handling. Her breath hitched as she lifted it from the drawer. It wasn't locked, but the lid had been fitted tightly, as if to protect whatever lay inside. She carried it back to the counter, settling onto the stool before carefully prying it open. Inside was a single brass key. Clara stared at it, her fingers hovering over the cool metal. It was larger than an ordinary house key, the edges worn but well crafted. She turned it over in her palm, tracing the simple design at its bow. This was no ordinary key. It had a purpose, a place where it belonged. Her pulse quickened. Was this what her father had hidden? Was this what Elias had been meant to find? A sudden gust of wind rattled the front windows, and she jolted, her heart skipping a beat. The lanterns flickered, casting restless shadows over the shelves, making them seem as though they whispered among themselves. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. It was just the wind, nothing more. And yet, as she turned the key over once more, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much larger than herself. The brass key felt heavy in her hand, as if weighted with the passage of time. She pressed her thumb against its bow, her mind racing through the possibilities. What door could it unlock? She had lived in the store her entire life, explored every hidden corner, and yet, had she? Her father had been a careful man, a thoughtful one. If he had hidden this key, it was for a reason, but where? Clara glanced around the store, her gaze sweeping over the wooden beams and shelves that had stood for decades. Then her eyes landed on the back wall, the storage room door. It had always been there, always locked when she was a child, but she had never questioned it. Her father had called it the storeroom for old accounts and rarely let anyone inside. When he passed, she had taken over, but the door had remained untouched. Had she ever actually opened it? She stepped closer, the key still clutched tightly in her fingers. The storeroom door stood silent before her, its wooden surface worn but sturdy, the brass handle reflecting the dim lantern light. Was this it? Was this where the key belonged? A nervous energy rippled through her. The store had always been a place of comfort, of warmth and familiarity. But tonight, standing before the locked door, she felt something new, a sense of the unknown, a quiet thrill of discovery. She inhaled deeply and slid the key into the lock. The metal fit snugly, as if it had always been meant to rest there. Her pulse quickened as she turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, click. The lock gave way with a soft, reluctant sigh, as though exhaling a breath it had been holding for far too long. Clara hesitated. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a steady, insistent rhythm. The past was waiting on the other side of this door. Whatever her father had left behind, whatever secrets had been tucked away for years, she was about to uncover them. She tightened her grip on the handle and pushed the door open. The air inside was cool, carrying the scent of dust and aged wood. The room beyond was dark, untouched by the lantern's glow. For a moment, Clara could make out nothing but shadows, shifting and uncertain. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. Lined against the walls were wooden crates and trunks, each labeled in her father's handwriting. Some bore familiar names, customers she had known for years. Others were marked with symbols she did not recognize. And then, near the center of the room, a single desk sat waiting, its surface covered in neatly stacked letters. Her father's letters. Clara's fingers trembled as she reached for the first one, unfolding the parchment with careful hands. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained clear. To be opened when the time is right. She swallowed hard. What had her father known? What had he been preparing for? The answer was in these letters, in the crates, in the trunks filled with secrets left behind. And as the lantern light flickered against the shelves, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The air in the storeroom was thick with dust and time, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally disturb its silence. Clara Whitmore took a slow step forward, her boots brushing against the wooden planks, sending up faint clouds of dust that danced in the dim lantern light. The weight of her father's secrets pressed down on her, heavy as the ledgers that lined the old shelves. The letters on the desk, neatly stacked and labeled in his handwriting, felt almost like whispers from the past. She reached for the topmost letter, fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the parchment. The ink had faded with time, but the words remained clear. If you are reading this, then the moment has come. The past cannot be buried forever. A shiver rippled down her spine. She had spent the last week uncovering pieces of her father's past, but this was something different. The words felt final, as if he had always known there would come a day when she, or someone else, would have to face what had been left behind. Before she could read further, a sudden clap of thunder rolled through the air, shaking the very foundation of the store. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting elongated shadows along the walls. Clara's breath hitched as she turned toward the doorway, her heart pounding. A storm. She had seen the clouds thickening earlier that evening, but had thought nothing of it. Now the rain had begun. A steady patter against the windows that quickly turned into a fierce, unrelenting downpour. The wind howled, rattling the shutters and sending a deep chill through the store. Clara swallowed, her grip tightening around the letter. She had planned to leave after locking up, but with the storm raging outside, it looked like she would be staying the night. A sudden, sharp gust pushed against the front door, making the bell jingle as if someone had entered. Clara stepped back into the main store, peering toward the entrance. But there was no one there. The storm was playing tricks on her senses, making the store feel more alive than ever before. She exhaled slowly and moved toward the door, securing the latch. The wind pushed back against her, as if resisting. With effort, she bolted it shut, sealing herself inside, safe for now. But as she turned back toward the storeroom, something caught her eye. A shadow, shifting near the back of the store. Her pulse quickened. She took a cautious step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. The shadow moved again, just at the edge of the lantern's glow, blending with the tall shelves. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. Just the steady hum of rain and the low growl of thunder. She reached for the nearest lantern, lifting it high. The golden light stretched across the space, illuminating every corner. Nothing. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Just the storm, she told herself. Just the shifting of light, the tricks of a restless mind. She turned back toward the storeroom, but before she could take another step, something clinked against the floor. She froze. The sound had come from near the counter. A soft metallic chime, like something small and heavy hitting the wooden planks. She hesitated, then cautiously made her way toward the sound. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lantern, casting light over the floorboards. And there, just beneath the counter, lay another key. Not brass like the first one. This one was iron, darker, heavier, with an ornate bow shaped like a swirling vine. She bent down, carefully picking it up. The weight of it sent a shudder through her fingertips. Her father had left one key hidden in the wooden box, leading her to the storeroom. But where had this one come from? Had it been here all along? Or had something, led her to it? Clara swallowed hard. The store had always been a place of warmth, of familiarity. But tonight, in the storm's embrace, it felt different. It felt like the past was waking up. She held the iron key tightly, her pulse racing. Somewhere in this store, there was another lock, another secret waiting to be opened. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to find out what lay beyond it. The storm continued its relentless assault on Sweetwater Creek, wind lashing against the store's wooden frame, rain drumming against the windows. Inside, the store was dim and hushed, the golden light from the lanterns flickering against the shelves, casting shifting shadows that made the space feel alive. Clara Whitmore stood near the counter, staring down at the iron key in her palm, its cold weight pressing against her skin. This key was different. It was older, more intricate than the first, its design more deliberate. Her father had left her one key already, leading her to the storeroom and the letters that had lain hidden for years. But this had appeared out of nowhere. Had it been here all along, waiting to be found, or had it been placed for her to discover now? A shudder worked its way through her, but she shook it off. She needed answers, not speculation. Her father had left her a puzzle, and she intended to solve it. Her gaze flickered toward the storage room. If this key belonged anywhere, it would be there. The trunks, the crates, the desk, they had all been left untouched for too long. Steeling herself, she lifted her lantern and made her way toward the back. The storeroom was colder than before, the chill seeping through her sleeves. The storm's howling wind rattled the windows, making the room feel even more isolated, as if it were cut off from the rest of the world. Clara set the lantern down on the desk and scanned the room, searching for anything that might match the iron key's unusual shape. Her eyes fell on a small chest nestled between two old crates. Unlike the others, which were battered by time and use, this one looked untouched, its dark wood polished despite the dust settling around it. Clara knelt beside it, heart pounding as she ran her fingers over the lid. There, just below the handle, was a keyhole, its shape matching the iron key exactly. She inhaled sharply. This was it. Hands steady but heart racing, she fitted the key into the lock. For a moment it resisted. Then, with a quiet click, the lock gave way, and the lid lifted slightly, as if the chest itself had been holding its breath. Clara hesitated only a moment longer before lifting the lid fully. Inside, resting atop a neatly folded cloth, was a leather-bound journal, its edges worn from use. Next to it sat a small velvet pouch, tied tightly with a delicate golden ribbon. She reached for the journal first, fingers grazing the familiar, careful script embossed on its cover. George Whitmore, her father's journal. Clara's throat tightened. She had never known her father to keep a journal, at least not one meant for private thoughts. He had always written in ledgers, recording numbers and transactions, but this was something else. With careful hands, she opened to the first page. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still legible. For the one who will find this, know that I never meant for secrets to remain buried. If you are reading this, then the time has come to set things right. She flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. The handwriting remained steady, though the words grew heavier, more urgent. Her father had written about Elias Hargrove, about the debt that had driven him away, about the deal that had been made behind closed doors. But there was something else. A name. Jonathan Calloway. Clara's stomach twisted. She had heard that name before, spoken in hushed voices, in warnings given by townsfolk about deals that could never be broken. He was a man of influence, of wealth, but more than that, he was a man whose name lingered in the air long after he was gone. Her father's entry continued. I had no choice but to keep it safe. He came looking for it once before, but I told him it was gone. I couldn't let him take what wasn't his. I couldn't let him take what belonged to Elias. Clara's hands tightened around the journal. This was bigger than she had realized. Her father hadn't just been keeping a secret. He had been protecting something. And if Jonathan Calloway had come once before, what was stopping him from coming again? Her breath came faster now, her mind racing. What had her father been hiding? The deed, the letters, or something else entirely? Her gaze flickered to the velvet pouch beside the journal. Slowly, cautiously, she untied the ribbon and tipped the contents into her palm. A ring fell into her hand, gleaming even in the dim lantern light. The band was simple but elegant, its surface engraved with a crest she did not recognize. The weight of it felt heavier than its size should allow. Her father had kept this hidden. He had lied to keep it safe. And now it was in her hands. The storm outside roared against the windows as if trying to break its way in, the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Clara's fingers closed around the ring, her pulse pounding. She had thought she had uncovered all of her father's secrets. But this was just the beginning. The storm had passed, leaving behind the crisp scent of rain-soaked earth and the gentle rustling of tree branches still dripping from the downpour. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Whitmore's general store, casting soft golden hues along the wooden shelves. The world outside had been washed clean, but inside, Clara Whitmore's mind remained tangled in the storm of revelations from the night before. The ring sat on the counter, its engraved crest glinting in the early light. The leather-bound journal rested beside it, its pages filled with the words of a father who had spent his life safeguarding secrets. Clara had barely slept, spending the night poring over its entries, unraveling the truths her father had hidden for so long. Jonathan Calloway. Even seeing the name written in her father's precise hand made her uneasy. He had been a man of quiet power, someone who controlled things without ever needing to raise his voice. If he had come looking for the ring before, what was stopping him from trying again? And why had her father gone to such great lengths to keep it out of his hands? A sharp knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. The store had not yet opened, but that never stopped some of the early risers from trying their luck. With a sigh, she tucked the ring into her pocket and moved to unlock the door. To her surprise, Elias Hargrove stood on the other side, his hat in one hand, his expression unreadable. His presence felt heavier now, burdened by the truth they had both uncovered. His gaze flickered toward the counter, toward the journal, as if he already knew what lay inside. "You found it," he said simply. Clara nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "It was in the storeroom, locked away. My father wrote about you, about Calloway." She hesitated, then added, "about what he was protecting." Elias inhaled deeply, removing his coat and setting it over a chair. "Then it's time we stop pretending the past doesn't matter." He moved toward the counter, fingers brushing against the edge of the journal, but not yet opening it. His posture was tense, as if touching the book might make the memories come rushing back too quickly. Calloway always gets what he wants, he murmured. And if your father kept this from him, then we need to be careful. Clara nodded, her mind racing. What exactly does he want? Elias hesitated, then exhaled. Power, influence, legitimacy. That ring isn't just a piece of jewelry, it's a symbol, a mark of something bigger. If Calloway wanted it, it's because it proves something. And men like him don't like loose ends. Clara swallowed. The weight of the ring in her pocket felt heavier now, as if she could feel the burden of history pressing against her. Then what do we do? Elias finally turned to face her, his expression serious. We do what your father started. We keep it safe, and we don't let Calloway or anyone else rewrite the story. Before Clara could respond, the store bell jingled as the door swung open, and Silas Finch strolled in, his ever-present smirk in place. He took one look at the two of them and let out a low chuckle. Well now, looks like I walked into the middle of something important. Clara sighed. You always do. Silas tipped his hat back and leaned against the counter. If I didn't, life would be awfully dull, wouldn't it? His sharp gaze flicked toward the journal. That what I think it is? Clara nodded. My father's journal. Silas let out a slow whistle. Well then, that means there's only one thing left to do. Clara frowned. And what's that? Silas grinned, spreading his arms wide. We celebrate. You're sitting on a goldmine of stories, Miss Whitmore, and if there's one thing this town loves, it's a good tale. Clara blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not one of them. Celebrate? She repeated. Silas, this isn't. Isn't what? Silas interrupted. Isn't the kind of thing that brings people together? That reminds them of where they come from? 'Cause I'd say otherwise. He tapped the counter with his knuckles. Your father kept a lot of secrets, sure. But he also built this place on trust, on community. This store ain't just about what's been hidden. It's about what's been shared. Elias tilted his head, considering. You're talking about a gathering. Silas shrugged. Why not? Folks here love a good story, and what better way to honor your father than to share some of his? Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing over the leather cover of the journal. Could it be that simple? That instead of keeping this truth hidden, she should be sharing it? She thought about the customers who came through these doors every day, the ones who had known her father, who had trusted him. She thought about the way he had always listened, always collected the stories of this town like precious keepsakes. And she knew Silas was right. A slow smile spread across her face. All right, she said, straightening her shoulders. Then let's tell some stories. Silas clapped his hands together. Now that's what I like to hear. Clara turned to Elias. You in? He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. If this is about setting things right, then yes. She exhaled, glancing out the window as the last remnants of the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a bright blue sky beyond. The town of Sweetwater Creek had always thrived on its stories, on the connections between its people. And now it was time to share one more. The afternoon sun hung warm and golden over Sweetwater Creek, casting soft light on the storefront of Whitmore's general store. A gentle breeze stirred the lace curtains in the windows, carrying with it the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. The town was alive, voices mingling as people gathered outside, drawn by the promise of something more than their usual errands, a story waiting to be told. Inside, Clara Whitmore stood behind the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. The store had been bustling all morning, customers coming and going, eager whispers spreading the news that something special was happening today. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over the journal that now lay open on the counter. The familiar scrawl of her father's handwriting felt less like a mystery now, and more like an invitation. A guide to the past, meant to be shared, not hidden. Elias Hargrove stood nearby, hands in his pockets, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd forming outside the door. He had spent years running from his past, but today he stood still, ready to face it. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded. "It's time." Silas Finch strolled in from outside, grinning as he adjusted his hat. "Folks are gathering faster than ants on a sugar spill. You got a mighty curious town, Miss Whitmore." Clara chuckled, despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "They've been waiting for something like this." Silas leaned against the counter. "Well then, don't keep 'em waitin'." She nodded, then stepped out from behind the counter and made her way to the store's entrance. The bell jingled as she opened the door, and the gathered crowd fell into a hush, anticipation crackling in the air. "Thank you all for coming," Clara began, her voice steady but warm. She glanced around at the familiar faces, Mrs. Abernathy, the Lawson family, old Mr. Reed, and dozens of others who had been a part of this town for longer than she had been alive. "As many of you know, my father built this store not just to sell goods, but to bring people together. And now, I think it's time to honor that tradition." She held up the journal, letting the sunlight catch on its worn leather cover. "What I found in this store isn't just old records. It's a piece of our history. Of my father's, of Elias's, of Sweetwater Creek itself." She met Elias's gaze, offering a small nod. "And I think it's time we share it." A murmur ran through the crowd, excitement sparking like fireflies on a summer night. Silas stepped forward, a twinkle in his eye. "So what do you say, folks? Shall we bring back an old tradition? A night of stories, laughter, and a bit of truth?" The crowd responded with eager nods and murmurs of agreement. That evening, as lanterns were lit and chairs were pulled close, the store transformed into something magical. Clara read from her father's journal, sharing pieces of history long forgotten, while others took turns recounting their own tales, memories of the town, of its people, of the small moments that had built their lives together. Elias spoke, too, for the first time in years, about his father, about the choices that had shaped him, about the second chance he never thought he'd get. And in that moment, he was not just the man who had left. He was part of the town once more. As the evening stretched on, laughter and warmth filled the store, just as it had in her father's time. The shadows of the past no longer loomed so large. The store had always been more than a place to buy and sell. It had been a home for stories, and tonight it became one again. As the last of the guests departed, Clara lingered by the door, watching the glow of lanterns fade into the quiet night. Elias stepped beside her. "You did good tonight," she smiled, feeling lighter than she had in days. "We all did." Silas yawned dramatically, stretching his arms. "Well, I'd say that's enough excitement for one day. Unless, of course, someone's got another mystery hidden under the floorboards?" Clara laughed, shaking her head. "Not tonight, Silas." He tipped his hat. "Then I'll bid you both good night." "And Miss Whitmore?" She raised a brow. "Yes?" His grin widened. "This place suits you." As he wandered off, Clara turned to Elias. "You staying in town?" He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think I am." Clara breathed in the cool night air, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The stories of Sweetwater Creek would live on, and with them, so would the legacy of Whitmore's General Store. And this was only the beginning. Thank you for visiting Story Planet. Stories have a way of finding us at just the right moment. Thank you for stepping into the world of Whitmore's General Store, for walking through the creaking wooden floors, for listening to the whispers of the past. If this story spoke to you, if you felt the warmth of Sweetwater Creek, consider sharing it with someone who might love it too. And if you'd like to hear more stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.